Add in, and we will get underway. Hi, everybody. Welcome to Coalition for Jewish Values' latest webinar. I am honored to bring in our special guest, Ilya Shapiro, who I know, as you may have just heard, he's class of 99 from Princeton. I'm class of 86. We are both in a chat that seems to alternately be about the great things that Chabad is doing at Princeton to keep Jewish life going and bemoaning the sad and sorry state of affairs at Princeton and in academia in general, which of course is the topic of today's talk. Ilya is Senior Fellow and Director of Constitutional Studies at the Manhattan Institute and a contributing editor of City Journal. Before that, he was Executive Director of the Georgetown Center for the Constitution and in the past was a Vice President at Cato Institute. As a result, besides being the author of Lawless, the Miseducation of America's Elites, and which you can see on the shelf, Mr. Shapiro, right there. And, well, where's a copy of Supreme Disorder, Judicial Nominations, and the Politics, there we go, of America's Highest Court? Is co-author of Religious Liberties for Corporations and editor of 11 volumes of the Cato Supreme Court Review. What we're going to be talking about today is the Overton Window, which a lot of our listeners may not have heard of. Elias, you may want to walk through like what exactly that is. But basically, it's the range of opinions that are acceptable to talk about in the public policy sphere, in academia, etc., and how much it has shifted, especially after October 7th. It has become totally normalized and acceptable to talk about Jews in a negative light, even as the facade to claim that this is just about being anti-Israel has tattered. We'll have Ilya speak to us for about 30 to 35 minutes, and we will then have a Q&A, which I will be glad to moderate. So while the talk is going on, when a question arises, go ahead and put your question into the chat. You don't need to wait for Q&A because I'll be keeping track of the questions, and we will then pose them to Ilya from the chat so that people can answer them. So go ahead and enter your questions as they arise. We will do our best to get to every question, but we do plan to end shortly, right around 3 p.m. Eastern Standard. So, Ilya, please take it away.
Great. Well, thanks, Rabbi Mencken. Thanks to the Coalition of Jewish Values. It's a Sunday, it's Father's Day. We're in my household all caught up in World Cup fever, so you'll excuse more casual than normal appearance here. But this is an important topic, nonetheless, as you're all aware. It's an honor to speak to this community about a subject that's painful, maddening, and unfortunately clarifying. I was asked, one of the staff members asked to have some sort of slides to accompany this. I generally don't use that. I find PowerPoint to be unconstitutional, at least as applied in 90% of cases. And I had neither an intern nor AI put together some. You can imagine some illustrations as I'm talking, but nonetheless, hopefully you'll stay focused on what I have to say. I should say at the outset, lest there be any doubt that I'm not a rabbi and I don't pretend to offer theological wisdom. My comparative advantage, such as it is as a constitutional lawyer, a scholar of legal education, and someone who has had more so-called lived experience with the modern academy than I ever wanted. The title of the talk is What Happened to Academia After October 7th? My first answer is October 7th didn't transform academia so much as reveal it. Hamas's massacre didn't create the crisis in higher education. It exposed a crisis that has been metastasizing for years. Ideological conformity, bureaucratic cowardice, the collapse of viewpoint diversity, the weaponization of DEI, and the replacement of truth-seeking with activism. It's still amazing that the heart of anti-Semitism in America lies on campus, among the most educated and so-called progressive people in the country. But that's where we are, and we should remember the chronology. The celebrations of resistance, the rationalization of terror, and the increasingly open contempt for Jews didn't begin when Israel went into Gaza. They began right after the largest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. At precisely the moment when moral clarity should have been easiest, our most prestigious universities became confused, evasive, or worse. Erwin Chemerinsky, the dean of Berkeley Law, wrote soon after Hamas's attack that as a 70-year-old Jewish man, quote, never in my life have I seen or felt the anti-Semitism of the last few weeks. Well, some of us were less surprised because we had been watching the anti-Israel, anti-American, and generally anti-Western ideology take root in higher education for a long time. Bill Ackman put it well in an essay the day that Claudine Gay resigned as Harvard's president. Anti-Semitism is the canary in the coal mine. It's the oldest hatred, but it's also a leading indicator. When anti-Semitism becomes acceptable in elite institutions, it tells you that those institutions' immune systems have failed. It tells you that their commitments to truth, fairness, due process, free speech, equal treatment, and basic decency have become subordinate to ideology. That's why the campus anti-Semitism problem can't be treated as one discrete issue. It's not that universities merely need a new task force, another listening session, another mandatory training module. The problem is deeper. Anti-Semitism after October 7th exposed the intellectual and moral rot in the university itself. The way to understand this is through the Overton window, as Rabbi Mencken said, the range of opinions considered acceptable in public discourse. In a healthy intellectual culture, that window is broad enough for real debate, but not so broad that barbarism becomes fashionable. In academia, the window has been distorted in both directions. So, on one side, mainstream conservative views on affirmative action, abortion, policing, religious liberty, biology, immigration, and the Constitution have been pushed outside acceptable discourse. And on the other side, forms of anti Jewish rhetoric that once would have been recognized as grotesque have been pulled into the realm of sophistication. That's the great inversion here. A student or professor who questions racial preferences may be accused of violence, white supremacy, or harm. But a student group that describes the murder of Jews as decolonization, or chants to globalize the Intifada, or treats Zionism as uniquely demonic, is often treated as engaging in brave, if perhaps complicated, political speech. Before October 7th, the Overton window in academia had narrowed dramatically against dissent from progressive orthodoxy. After October 7th, it widened dramatically for anti Semitism, so long as that anti Semitism was dressed up in the language of anti Zionism, decolonization, liberation, social justice. Zionist became the socially acceptable way to say Jew while maintaining plausible deniability. Resistance became the euphemism. Context became the word administrators used to explain away shameful behavior. The root cause is the noxious postmodern ideology that's captured much of elite education. It contends that truth is subjective and must be viewed through lenses of race, gender, sexuality, and other identity categories, according to some hierarchy of privilege. Rights and freedoms depend on whether you're part of a class deemed oppressor or oppressed. Facts matter less than narratives. Intentions matter less than impact. Procedures matter less than outcomes. Equal treatment is dismissed as a trick used by the powerful to preserve their power. Jews present a problem for that worldview. We don't fit neatly into the identity boxes that campus ideology has created. Jews are a tiny minority, but they can be labeled privileged. Jews have suffered persecution across millennia, but can be treated as white. Jews can be targeted for ethnicity, religion, ancestry, and peoplehood, but then told that their fear is really an effort to silence the oppressed. Jews can have a deep historical, religious, cultural, and familial connection to Israel, but that connection is redescribed as settler colonialism. Once Israel becomes the world's ultimate oppressor, Jews who support Israel, or who simply refuse to repudiate Israel on demand, become acceptable targets. This is a report called, where a report called Inclusion Delusion was so prescient. That came from the Heritage Foundation before that institution succumbed to right-wing illiberalism. Jay Green and James Paul examined the public communications of 700 DEI personnel at 65 universities. They found that these staffers engaged with 3 times as many posts about Israel as about China. Of the Israel-related posts, 96% were critical of the Jewish state. Of the China-related posts, 62% were favorable. There were more DEI staff posts referencing apartheid in Israel than posts saying anything favorable about Israel at all. Now, that was in 2021, 2 years before October 7th. The point isn't that criticism of Israel is automatically anti Semitic. Students must be free to criticize Israel, Zionism, Netanyahu, the IDF, settlements, AIPAC, U.S. foreign policy, or anything else. The point is the obsessive disproportion, the double standard, and the ideological structure underneath it. The DEI apparatus was not a neutral inclusion machine that suddenly failed to protect Jews after October 7th. It had already absorbed a worldview in which Israel was uniquely evil and Jews were inconveniently positioned on the wrong side of that oppressor oppressed ledger. That's why campus anti-Semitism can't be solved by feeding it into the DEI machine. The machine is itself the problem. You don't cure poisoning by increasing the dose. Offices supposedly devoted to inclusion have often incubated hostility to the one minority group whose identity is tied, for most Jews, to a national homeland. They've trained students and administrators to see Jews as beneficiaries of power rather than targets of prejudice. And so they're very good at detecting microaggressions invisible to the naked eye, but suddenly blind when Jewish students are harassed, blocked, spat on, excluded, or told that they had it coming. This also explains the bizarre asymmetry in institutional reactions. Universities that had issued rapid confidence statements on every fashionable cause suddenly discovered nuance after the slaughter of Jews. Administrators who police pronouns and land acknowledgments, who can find structural violence in a seminar syllabus, became uncertain whether calls to globalize the Intifada made Jewish students feel unsafe. They had spent years teaching students that silence is violence, and then, when Jews were murdered, they became very interested in the virtues of silence. They had spent years teaching that words are violence. Then, when the words were from the river to the sea, they rediscovered free speech. As someone who has spent his career defending offensive, unpopular, and even ugly speech, I want to be clear about the line. Criticism of Israel is protected speech. Harsh criticism is protected speech. Stupid, offensive, one-sided, historically illiterate criticism is protected speech. But there's no First Amendment right to threaten Jewish students or block them from campus spaces, occupy buildings, disrupt classes, vandalize property, urinate on Hillels, or otherwise create a hostile environment based on shared ancestry. Civil rights and free speech are not opposing values. Neutral rules, consistently enforced, protect everyone. I go into depth into all of these different categories in an essay I wrote almost 3 years ago for the Free Press. It was called the Limits of Free Speech. The problem is that our universities stopped enforcing neutral rules. They enforce rules based on political pressure, not principle. They treat disfavored speech as violence and intimidation as expression. They blur the distinction in both directions, and Jews have paid the price. And this is especially dangerous in legal education, which is the focus of my last book, Lawless. Law schools are different from English departments or sociology departments. They train future lawyers, judges, prosecutors, general counsel, legislators, agency officials, the gatekeepers of our legal and political institutions. When law students are taught that due process and free speech are tools of oppression, or that equal application of law entrenches white supremacy, the damage doesn't stay on campus. It enters courtrooms, boardrooms, government agencies, and the enforcement apparatus of the state. A law school's job is to train people who can separate facts from feelings, argument from intimidation, and law from politics. A lawyer must be able to represent an unpopular client, cross-examine a sympathetic witness, and accept procedural constraints even when he thinks the result unjust. But if law schools teach students that procedures are obstacles to justice and neutrality is complicity, they aren't merely failing to educate. They're creating a cadre of credentialed activists hostile to the very norms that make civil rights enforceable. We got previews of this before October 7th. I had one personally in March of 2022 when I tried to speak at the law school formerly known as UC Hastings. The Federalist Society had invited me to discuss the politics of judicial nominations, the subject of my previous book, Supreme Disorder. But a heckler's veto prevailed. The response from students was basically, shut up, cleaned up for polite company. They chanted and banged like it was an Occupy Wall Street meeting, preventing the event from taking place. My offense, as some of you may be aware, was a poorly phrased tweet criticizing President Biden's Supreme Court nomination criteria. I deleted the tweet and apologized for the wording, but I still think Biden should have considered all possible nominees, as 76% of Americans agreed in a poll by that rabid right wing outlet ABC News. But the protesters didn't want to debate judicial selection. They had judged me a racist misogynist and my expertise illegitimate. They demanded that the school create a committee of diverse student representatives to approve speakers, plus, of course, mandatory training in critical race theory. And nobody was disciplined. The point isn't that every disruptive student is a future terrorist sympathizer or that every administrator consciously wants to hurt Jews. The point is institutional formation. If you teach young people for years that disagreement is harm, that law is power, that Western civilization is oppression, that identity determines moral authority, and that shouting down a speaker is virtuous praxis, you shouldn't be shocked when they apply those lessons. And if the only people they're allowed to shout down are conservatives, Christians, originalists, pro-lifers, Zionists, and other unfashionable groups, then you've also taught them who counts and who doesn't. And that's why the phrase, who defines diversity defines the future, which is the title of one of the chapters in Lawless, matters so much. Diversity sounds innocuous. Who's against it? I'm an immigrant from the Soviet Union who believes deeply in pluralism, free inquiry, and opportunity. But in the academy, diversity has been redefined to exclude the most important kind of diversity for an educational institution, intellectual diversity. It's also been redefined to count some identities and not others. Jewish identity counts when Jews are victims of white supremacists. It doesn't count when Jews are victims of people advocating decolonization. Israeli identity almost never counts. Zionist identity counts only as an accusation. This is how it became normalized to talk about Jews in a negative light while insisting that one is merely criticizing power. The move is simple. Strip Jews of minority status, code them as white or colonial or capitalist or Western, attach them to Israel, define Israel as uniquely evil, and then claim that hostility to Jews who refuse to disavow Israel is just anti-oppression. Once that intellectual laundering is complete, the most ancient hatred can be expressed in trendy terms. That Hastings episode wasn't about me. It was about the narrowing of the academic Overton window. Questioning identity-based selection criteria had become outside the range of acceptable policy views. The same mechanism would later be turned on Jews after October 7th. The moral sorting, the refusal to engage, the claim that speech causes harm, the use of institutional weakness to reward the loudest activists, and the selective rediscovery of free expression only when the mob's target is unfashionable. The Stanford shutdown of Judge Kyle Duncan a year later, 3 years ago now, made the same point even more vividly. A federal judge came to speak at a supposedly elite law school about legal doctrine. Students shouted him down. The DEI dean didn't restore order. She commandeered the event and asked whether the juice was worth the squeeze. That phrase itself deserves to live in infamy. It translates to, if a speaker's ideas offend the right people, perhaps the event shouldn't happen. That's not education. That's ratifying a heckler's veto in the language of therapy. And that's the larger story of Lawless. The problem isn't just ideology, it's bureaucracy. For decades, administrative positions grew far faster than faculty or student bodies. Students and families pay more, but not for more teaching. They subsidize a class of well-paid bureaucrats whose incentives are to expand their authority, manufacture crises, and enforce orthodoxy. What once were technocratic officers, paper pushers, ensuring compliance with regulations, have morphed into enforcers of racialism, radical gender ideology, and political conformity. Until very recently, DEI was the fastest growing and most ideologically charged part of that bureaucracy. Green and Paul found that the average large university had more than 45 DEI staff, which is more than the average number of history professors. Michigan's DEI bureaucracy grew to hundreds of people at a cost exceeding $30 million dollars a year. These offices broaden terms like harassment, discrimination, harm, and safety, not to promote equal opportunity, but to enforce progressive ideology. They shift power away from faculty and toward political commissars whose goals diverge from the traditional higher ed values of open inquiry, academic freedom, and truth seeking. So yeah, there's a huge problem with faculty, but that's been going on for decades, and we can talk about that. But this non-teaching part, this bureaucracy that has become the tail that wags the dog, is really something. And that structure explains the post-October 7th campus meltdown. At NYU Law, a student leader blamed Israel for Hamas's massacre. At Berkeley, protesters disrupted a dinner at Dean Chemerinsky's home. The Columbia campus became a national symbol of encampments, intimidation, administrative paralysis. Student editors at the Columbia Law Review demanded academic dispensation after police cleared an encampment. These weren't isolated excesses by teenagers who needed to mature. They were the predictable product of institutions that had spent years teaching that politics is a morality play, harm is whatever the most ideologically favored complainant says it is, and rules must bend to power-laden narratives. The Harvard spectacle crystallized the issue for many people. Claudine Gay was not the problem, she was a symptom. Her resignation didn't end Harvard's troubles because the problem was never just one president. It was the campus culture, the bureaucratic incentives, and the intellectual corruption that facilitated her rise and then produced the institution's disastrous response to anti-Semitism. Harvard may be the most famous example, and Columbia the most visible, but they're not alone. So what do we do? Well, first, universities need institutional neutrality. They shouldn't issue statements on every political controversy. They shouldn't pretend to be moral arbiters of the world. The more universities take official positions, the more they invite pressure campaigns to control those positions. And when a university speaks constantly, its silence becomes conspicuous. That's why so many were trapped after October 7th. They had spoken on everything, so their hesitation spoke volumes. Institutional neutrality doesn't mean moral indifference. It means a university knows what it's for. It exists to seek truth, develop knowledge, and educate students. It's not a political party, an NGO, a therapy clinic, or a revolutionary cell. It can enforce rules, it can protect students, but it shouldn't maintain a foreign policy ministry. Second, universities must enforce their own rules, not selectively, not after negotiating with the mob, not after waiting to see which way donors, activists, and the New York Times opinion page are leaning. They need clear conduct rules and consistent discipline for disruption, harassment, vandalism, threats, and exclusion from campus spaces. The lesson is simple. When there's no institutional prize for mob pressure, there's less reason to mob. Third, universities must dismantle DEI bureaucracies, leaving only civil rights compliance functions that operate under neutral law rather than ideological activism. Civil rights compliance is important because universities that receive federal funds have legal obligations. Title VI prohibits discrimination based on race, color, and national origin, which has long been understood to cover shared ancestry and ethnicity, including Jews. But civil rights enforcement should mean equal treatment under neutral rules, not progressive catechism administered by diversicrats. Fourth, end mandatory diversity training and political litmus tests. Diversity statements function as loyalty oaths. Mandatory trainings teach identity-based grievance, guilt, and division, while rejecting the basic American premise that everyone should be treated as an individual rather than as a component of a racial, religious, sexual, or national class. Universities should stop coercing students and faculty into affirming contestable political beliefs. Fifth, external accountability is necessary because internal accountability has failed. I'd prefer that universities reform themselves. I'm generally long on America. Like Brett Kavanaugh, I live on the sunrise side of the mountain. But I'm pessimistic about academia. Too many presidents, provosts, deans, general counsel, and trustees have shown themselves unwilling to stand up to the loudest activists on campus. That means alumni, donors, employers, judges, state legislators, attorneys general, Congress, federal agencies, and accreditation bodies all have roles to play. Taxpayer funds should not subsidize institutions that tolerate discrimination while congratulating themselves on moral sophistication. Judges and employers should ask whether schools that train students to shout down speakers or rationalize Hamas apologia are producing graduates with the judgment necessary for positions of trust. Law firms that tell deans they won't hire graduates who engage in harassment against Jewish students aren't suppressing speech, they're announcing professional standards. There's a difference between viewpoint and conduct, debate and intimidation, zealous advocacy and moral imbecility. Sixth, sunlight works. Public exposure makes cowardice more expensive and reform more likely. When ideological litmus tests, diversity statements, corrupt hiring practices, double standards, or administrative evasions are exposed, institutions often respond. Not always from conviction, but because embarrassment can do what what principle no longer does. The academy needs more transparency, disciplinary records, complaint timelines, communications among university officials and protest leaders, and comparisons between how schools respond to anti-Semitic harassment and how they respond to alleged bias against groups more favored by campus ideology. The goal is not to make campuses pro-Israel or suppress criticism of Israel or to create safe spaces for Jews where nobody ever hears something offensive. The goal is to make universities universities again, places where students learn to reason, debate, listen, and live under neutral rules. Jewish students don't need favors. They need the same protection administrators would rush to provide any group: access to campus, equal treatment, and freedom from harassment and intimidation. They need universities to rediscover that equality under law isn't a slogan, but a discipline. Nor should reform be confused with censorship. Universities should recover a distinction that once was obvious. Speech is protected, conduct can be punished, and harassment that denies educational access is a civil rights problem. Restoring that distinction would help Jewish students, but also every student who wants an education instead of an ideological boot camp. So, what happened to academia after October 7th? The Academy showed us what it had become. It showed us that the Overton window had been moved by people who claimed to oppose hate, but had made room for the oldest hatred. It showed us that institutions obsessed with inclusion could exclude Jews. It showed us that administrators fluent in the language of harm couldn't recognize harm when Jews were the victims. It showed us that universities that promised education had become engines of activism. And it showed us that the crisis of anti-Semitism is inseparable from the crisis of academic freedom, merit, civil discourse, and the rule of law. But October 7th also forced a reckoning. Parents, students, alumni, donors, employers, and ordinary citizens saw what many of us had been warning for many years. They saw that a university unable to condemn the slaughter of Jews without consulting an intersectional matrix had lost its moral bearings. They saw that a law school unable to distinguish protected speech from targeted harassment had failed at its most basic pedagogical task. They saw that a bureaucracy that sees Jews as too privileged to count has forfeited any claim to the word inclusion. For the Jewish community, the lesson is both sobering and clarifying. We shouldn't beg for admission into ideological frameworks that can't see us. We shouldn't plead with DEI offices to add anti-Semitism as one more module while leaving the deeper ideology untouched. We should insist on equal treatment, neutral rules, institutional courage, and moral clarity. We should defend free speech even for those who hate us, but we should never confuse free speech with the right to intimidate, harass, or exclude. We should demand that universities live by their own principles, or stop taking public money while violating them. Alexander Solzhenitsyn warned, "Live not by lies." That's become a mantra for me. The lie in academia is that all of this is about compassion, inclusion, and justice. It's not. A system that excuses anti-Semitism because Jews are deemed to be on the wrong side of the oppressor-oppressed line isn't compassionate. A system that silences dissent and rewards mobs isn't inclusive. A system that abandons neutral rules isn't just. The recovery of academia will require courage. It'll require trustees who remember that they're fiduciaries, not potted plants. It'll require presidents willing to say no. It'll require faculty who stop whispering in hallways and start speaking in public. It'll require students who understand that education isn't therapy and disagreement isn't violence. It'll require donors and alumni who stop subsidizing their own contempt. And it'll require all of us to insist that truth, merit, freedom, and equality aren't Western constructs, but preconditions for a decent society. Anti Semitism is the canary in the coal mine because it reveals which institutions still believe in their own rules. On too many campuses after October 7th, the answer was not many. But now we know. And because we know, we can act. The task is not to move the Overton window back to some nostalgic past. The task is to restore the conditions under which serious disagreement is possible and moral barbarism is not fashionable. That means free speech, institutional neutrality, consistent rule enforcement, viewpoint diversity, and the disempowerment of DEI. It means civil rights enforcement that protects Jews not as a special class, but as equal citizens. It means universities that educate rather than indoctrinate. Exposure is the first step. Accountability is the second. Reform is the third. There's still a long way to go before universities return to their mission of seeking truth and developing knowledge, before law schools return to their mission of teaching future lawyers to uphold the rule of law. But the battle has been joined. Thanks very much, and with that, I look forward to a spirited discussion. Rabbi, you're muted if you're trying to speak.
There I go. I was
There you go.
trying to unmute myself and it wasn't, I was actually not having the authority. The team in the background had muted me so successfully that even I couldn't unmute. So that was good. Anyway, before we go into the Q&A, I just wanted to point out to everybody, thank you so much. This is a Coalition for Jewish Values webinar. And we, of course, depend on everybody for your support. If you want to know about what we're up to, go to cjvalues.org, or if you like typing, coalitionforjewishvalues.org will get you to the same place. And there you can subscribe to hear about our upcoming webinars before they happen. In the course of speaking, Ilya, you gave me the idea we should absolutely invite Jay Green, formerly of Heritage. I don't know if you know that he was part of the brain drain from Heritage in the wake of its little disaster over Tucker Carlson. And he is now dividing his time between the Do No Harm organization about trans procedures on kids, and also at I had it looked up here, over here, senior fellow at the Defense of Freedom Institute, where he's looking at anti-Semitism throughout the educational system. But yeah, his work on DEI, which, as you noted, was prior to October 7th, was amazing stuff on putting. I have
There's
often
a trio
said,
of reports. The first one is called Diversity University, then Inclusion Delusion, which I referenced, and there's one involving equity as well. But it's good
right.
stuff.
The third one in particular, or was it the second, Inclusion Delusion, that's particularly about anti-Semitism in Israel and the comparison to China, as you said. But for me, one of the biggest pieces of what he was doing was, as you have said, taking apart this idea that DEI was ever a constructive procedure, that it was ever something that was beneficial for the university or anybody else. It was really an excuse to elevate certain races and denigrate certain others. And of course, they neatly move the Jews into the privileged class just to make sure we're only being pushed outside.
It's
Um,
broader. It's broader than that. It's part
Go on.
of this critical theory, this kind of postmodern philosophy that originated from the Frankfurt School and migrated to Columbia in the 40s. And is intended to undermine existing structures and institutions because they have illegitimate power imbalances baked into them that divide along all sorts of identity, class, and other lines. And so the fundamental critique, uh, whether it's critical legal studies, whether it's critical race theory, queer theory, all of these different things, is that existing rules, institutions, structures need to be torn down and rebuilt according to a different, what's now called intersectional matrix.
A different standard. Absolutely. I was going to ask you about just to take it to Princeton because we both are. Uh, President Gruber of Princeton, who was until recently the president of the Association of University Professors or some such, uh, obviously, because Princeton sort of dodged the bullet, they weren't put under the microscope like Columbia, like Harvard, like Penn, which were the worst of the problem. So Gruber took up the mantle of being the fighter for academic freedom, where I feel personally he's done his best to obfuscate the difference between academic freedom or free speech, like you said, and endorsement of violence and endorsement of persecution of particular minorities, including on campus and including faculty participation, as happened at Princeton. Faculty participation in encampments where Jewish students were not welcome unless they passed a certain ideological test. I mean, obviously, one of the pieces of this that I think is always a part of this picture is that Judaism is unlike any other religion in its tie to one particular land. Catholics don't feel a pull to move to Rome. Jews feel a pull to move to Jerusalem. It's part of Judaism. And that's something that the bigots are very carefully masking and covering over. And again, the academics are just giving them uh, cover by putting this in the Near East or Middle East Studies Department, etc., failing to note that if you value freedom of religion for everybody, you've got to allow Jews to have a connection to their Holy Land, which again, like you said, has nothing to do with Netanyahu or government policies or anything else. It has to do with Jewish life in the Holy Land. So I wanted to ask you that Princeton connection, but Bill Hewitt, as you noted, our friend from the chat, has put the following in. Ilya, have you reviewed the September 2025 complaint to the Department of Education Office for Civil Rights against Princeton, which he authored, by the way? He doesn't put that. But using Princeton as an example, what is working and what is failing to work in terms of holding leadership to account, and where do you think we should focus our efforts?
Well, I don't want this to, focus parochially on Princeton. Grading on a curve, Princeton is one of the better Ivy League schools for all these issues. I think Dartmouth is probably the best. Um, but the others have, Harvard, Columbia, Yale, Penn have justly gotten more attention. They're much more egregious than anything that happened at Princeton. But Princeton shouldn't escape unscathed. I haven't reviewed in detail. I kind of skimmed that complaint. I hope OCR. I mean, Princeton is one of the dozens of schools that are being investigated. Stay tuned for what will happen with that. I think the Trump administration, Department of Justice, made a misstep that allowed Gruber to um, pursue his obfuscations in April of last year, sending letters and making various demands before concluding their investigations, because we saw what happened once they concluded investigations as they're supposed to under Title VI and laid a bill of complaint at the door of various universities. Very quickly, they got consent decrees, they got fines levied, etc. But because some of that, the cart went before the horse, people like Gruber and Harvard's Alan Garber got to say, "Oh, well, we're standing up for freedom against this government oppression," and that's unfortunate, just as a matter of basic politics and PR. Gruber's book is it's worth reading. I haven't read it myself, but I have read the extended, detailed five-part, what used to be called fisking kind of analysis by another Princeton alum, Tal Fortgang, who works with me at the Manhattan Institute. I think he's Princeton class of 19, maybe, then went to NYU Law. And I hope he turns that's on the website of Princetonians for Free Speech. But I hope he turns that 5-page series into like a City Journal feature or something like that. But it shows that yes, Eisgruber is kind of a traditional ACLU 1960s liberal is good about defining free speech and talking about it generally, but then kind of is blind to violations of free speech and perversions of viewpoint diversity. And much like the AAUP, in which he had been active, you mentioned that organization, kind of preferences equity over speech or other traditional classical liberal values. So I don't know whether it's just a blind spot from based on his training, of that generation, or something more nefarious. But either way, he's not the worst, but he's certainly it's like that Chernobyl biopic, right? Not good, not terrible.
Okay. So the next question that I wanted to address, and I get to do this one myself, because he said, I agree with everything you're saying, but aren't there a bunch of groups who agree, like FIRE, that comes from Freedom of Individual Rights in Education, who are there, and already have Jewish organizations? Why CJV? He asked. Like, what is our special value add that the other think tanks are not doing? As much as uh, Coalition for Jewish Values is here to represent everyone who is for Jewish values, and that's what we want to do. What gives us our authenticity, which is unique in this field, is that we are the largest rabbinic public policy organization in the country. We have an ability that other organizations do not, to speak down our noses at groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, which is a pro terror organization masquerading as a Jewish organization, and even organizations that have gone hopelessly left wing and progressive in their values and outlook while claiming to represent the Jewish people. Jewish opinion has always not represented everybody who is a Jew. The fact that I am a Jew and have an opinion does not make my opinion a Jewish opinion. A Jewish opinion is based on, well, look at the books behind me. I don't claim that I run the show. But if there's a complete consensus amongst traditional trained rabbis on an issue, like, for example, BDS is anti Semitic, there's something wrong with you if you claim that anti-Semitism better than the guys who've been studying it for 3,000 years. It's really that simple. And that's why a voice like ours is completely unique in the public policy sphere. I think, Ilya, you can second that. That there's nobody else doing what we do, and that makes it uniquely necessary at this, especially in a juncture like this. And for those who wish to support us, this is a great opportunity to point out, when you do go to our website at cjvalues.org, there's a big support button that we would love for you to take advantage of. That'll also get you a subscription, by the way, to all the updates on
I'll
what we're
I'll note
doing.
that FIRE is, I mean, it just protects people's free speech. It's obviously not a Jewish organization. It does what the ACLU used to do in terms of just defending free speech across all sorts of parameters. And they don't go in for illiberalism of the left or the right or censorship or all that. I have disagreements with them about certain things, the TikTok ban, which I don't think involved speech, and certain other things that we don't have to get into. But they put out an annual evaluation of free speech at universities. That's invaluable, and Eisgruber doesn't like them because Princeton doesn't get a good grade. Very few schools get good grades these days, but you know, different than CJV.
Good organizations abound, and it's a delight to work with all of them. And to see their work grow and develop, as mentioned, when Jay Green left Heritage Foundation, he had where to go. I don't know if you've watched Advancing American Freedom, which was really like it was rightly derided as Mike Pence's retirement home, when, he founded it, having left the first Trump administration, obviously at the end of Trump one. And now today it's turned into the new home for people leaving an entire department, the Meese Center. Was it on International Affairs that left Heritage?
Legal and judicial studies, and then a number of people. I think all told, they're up to 15 people who have gone from Heritage to AAF.
Yeah, it's quite something, including, of course, Amy Swear, who asked great questions in that famous or infamous town hall, depending on how you look at it. Somebody's been posting about Khalil Shikaki and the fact that he was indicted for his work on behalf of Palestinian Islamic Jihad, involvement in the World Islamic Studies Enterprise, and apparently now is a professor at Brandeis. And so she asked, what do you think is going to happen next? Why are you optimistic about reclaiming academia if this is going on even at Brandeis?
I don't know that specific case, so I really can't comment on that. I didn't. Uh, I wasn't necessarily trying to convey optimism. I'm perhaps less pessimistic than when I left Georgetown 4 years ago. I think there's a lot of differentiation. Some institutions will react and improve, some will not, and they will decline. And I think we're seeing a lot of churn right now. Look, for example, at the relative changes in popular perception and prestige as between University of Michigan and University of Florida, or the movement of not just Jews, but including Jews from northeastern schools to southeastern schools to the what used to be the old ACC and SEC in football terms. I call this as a movement away from the cold and the scold to better climates, both ideological and meteorological. And individual leaders have a lot of say over this. Daniel Diermeyer, the chancellor of Vanderbilt, is winning, continues to have national acclaim for simply kicking out protesters that had taken over his office and assaulted security guards. It's a low bar to get national acclaim. Just enforce your own rules. Or we saw in real time the difference in response to the illegal encampments at the University of Florida by then President Ben Sasse versus what was going on at Columbia. So, these are not intractable problems of public policy that have flared up either since October 7th or more broadly. But different institutions react in different ways. And so, the places that we think of as worthwhile are going to be different than what we do now or what we did 20 years ago.
I want to take on your point about not being intractable. First, CJV team did put in the chat for anybody who wants to see it, links to Ilya's Substack, to buy all three of Ilya's books, to subscribe to CJV, and to support CJV. But as far as it being intractable, my question, I guess, is Germany required a process of denazification to eliminate the ideology, to eliminate the hate for other people based on their ethnicity. It took a lot of time to get rid of racism in America, which still has, today it has very little foothold. For every person that's a racist, there's 20 saying, you can't be a racist like that. Stop being a bigot. Give everybody of every ethnicity a shot, except Jews. So the question is, how do you, when you say it's not an intractable problem, the thing is that it really has permeated all of academia, especially in the wake of October 7th. It's revealed that every member, based on the declaration of national SJP, every member of SJP is not only an anti-Semitic bigot, but also part of a gang. Like any other member of a gang, you don't have to be committing the crimes yourself to be part of the gang and therefore responsible for committing murders, rapes, kidnapping, starvation, and physical torture. That's what a member of SJP is. And yet there's 160 recognized chapters of SJP on university campuses across the country. How do you say that that's not an intractable problem when basically All of academia needs to be upended from the ground up to stop conferring academic degrees to barbarians, which of course, we should be reminded that half the architects of the Wannsee Conference, Hitler's final solution, had advanced academic degrees from what were at the time the world's finest universities, which permanently lost their reputation because of anti-Semitism. So, yeah, what needs to be done for American academia to reclaim itself before it's too late?
Well, I say the problem's not intractable because it's not particularly hard. The solutions are readily available. Don't just take it for, I've offered some. They're pretty straightforward. The problem is implementation, and the problem is a radical faculty with a generational shift of kind of baby boomer ACLU liberal types being replaced by more what are now called activist scholars or activist academics among millennials, and that all goes in that direction that I've described. Um, Solutions are, internally, schools should be pressured to adopt the what's known as the Chicago trifecta, the free speech principles, the Calvin report on institutional neutrality, and the Shills report on non discrimination based on viewpoint in faculty hiring. And that's perhaps the hardest one. But how schools can reform themselves, I think, will be almost entirely due to external pressure. Most university leaders, they themselves are not, I'm not talking about the DEI officials, but the presidents, the provosts, the deans are not themselves woke radicals or social justice warriors. They are successful careerist bureaucrats who have learned how to climb the greasy pole by responding to the incentives that they face. And so that incentive matrix has to be changed by pressure from employers, state legislatures, donors. When Harvard sees that donations are down 5%, just 5%, both as in terms of total funds and alumni participation rate, that sends off alarm bells because any finance guy will tell you don't want that to become a trend. When applications are down, that catches people's attention. But it'll take sustained pressure. One investigation by the Department of Justice is not enough. One attorney general doing something. You mentioned SJP. Jason Mayari is here in Virginia, where I live, launched an investigation into SJP, which I imagine has now being petered out or what have you. But there's a role for state officials, both executive branch and legislatures, who have been defunding DEI structures and performing their oversight functions in how universities are being run. It'll take a while. It's gotten, this did the illiberal takeover didn't happen overnight, and it's not going to be changed, quickly. And in some places, some institutions will not be salvageable. But it takes all of the above kind of solutions, including new institutions like these centers and institutes within existing universities, centers of classics and civic life and all these other ones, whatever they're called in different places. Alternative institutions like the University of Austin, very interesting experiment that will be starting its, I guess, welcoming its third class of students this fall. That Jeff Yass has given a lot of money to, such that they basically are guaranteeing students don't have to pay tuition. So lots of these uh, reform efforts will have to be tried. What gives me, again, not optimism but less pessimism, is that just a little sunlight affects decision makers' actions. My colleague John Saylor, who now runs higher education policy at the Manhattan Institute, a few years ago started using FOIA to get information, documents about hiring practices at various public schools. The first one was Texas Tech, and he found that they were hiring professors for economics, biology, whatever, based primarily on diversity statements. the day after his op-ed in the Wall Street Journal appeared on that, the chancellor of Texas Tech said, no, we're not going to do that anymore. That's not appropriate. And he's done that for school after school after school. So just a little bit of sunlight goes a long way. And also, we've seen the impact that a CEO can have even on academic institutions. Um, you know, people are familiar with Ben Sass, perhaps, and what he was turning around at the University of Florida, or Bob Zimmer at the University of Chicago. The late Bob Zimmer was a great leader. Elena Kagan, when she was dean of Harvard Law School, improved student life in various ways. It was miserable to be a law student at Harvard as compared to its peers. She fixed that in various ways, and she hired a bunch of heterodox, meaning non-progressive professors, including rating my own other alma mater, the University of Chicago Law School. So it's not because she herself is conservative, obviously, but because she proved herself to be a very strong academic leader. So again, this is not rocket science. We don't need to theorize a whole different solution for, novel problems of public policy. Just a matter of changing the incentive dynamics and forcing institutions to change.
Fantastic stuff. Really appreciate it. I'm going to recommend everybody, like I just realized, we are using Zoom. So when I say a final closing round of applause for Ilya and this fantastic